The German shepherd's claws scraped against ancient stone with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. Liberty dug with desperate fury in the moonlit cemetery, her powerful shoulders heaving as dirt flew behind her in dark arcs. Jake Whitmore stood frozen, watching his war-scarred companion tear at the earth above his grandfather's grave with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "Easy, girl," he whispered, but Liberty ignored him. Her amber eyes were wild, fixed on something buried 6 feet below weathered marble, something she could sense but he couldn't see. The metal briefcase emerged like a resurrection, tarnished brass gleaming in the pale light. Jake's hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside lay documents that would shatter everything he believed about his family. Bank statements, property deeds, a letter in his grandfather's familiar script, and proof that his own blood had been lying to him for 20 years. His brother Clayton wasn't just greedy. He was a thief. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, the mahogany-paneled walls of Sterling Associates had felt like a tomb. Jake Whitmore sat rigid in the leather chair, his Purple Heart weighing heavy in his jacket pocket, while his younger brother Clayton drummed manicured fingers against the conference table. The sound echoed like distant gunfire in Jake's damaged ears. Liberty lay at Jake's feet, her graying muzzle resting on scarred paws. The 6-year-old German shepherd bore her own war wounds, a slight limp from shrapnel, a missing piece of her left ear. She'd pulled Jake from a burning Humvee in Kandahar, earning them both an early ticket home and a lifetime of shared nightmares. "Gentlemen," Attorney Morrison cleared his throat, adjusting wire-rimmed spectacles, "your father's will is quite specific." He unfolded the document with ceremonial gravity. "To my son Clayton Whitmore, I leave the family mansion, all liquid assets totaling $2 million, and the Whitmore Holdings portfolio." Clayton's wife Carolyn squeezed his arm, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the afternoon light. She was New Orleans aristocracy, all sharp cheekbones and sharper tongue. "Thank God someone in this family made something of themselves," she murmured, loud enough for Jake to hear. Jake felt Liberty's muscles tense beneath his hand. The dog had never liked Carolyn, growling whenever she entered a room. Military working dogs had excellent instincts about people. "And to my son Jacob," Morrison continued, "I leave the 20-acre tract known as Sanctuary Point, including the caretaker's cottage and family cemetery, along with all responsibilities for maintenance and preservation." The silence stretched like a held breath. Clayton's eyes gleamed with barely concealed triumph. "The swampland. That worthless patch of mosquitoes and mud?" "It's not worthless," Jake said quietly, though his heart was sinking. 20 years of service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, and a disabled veteran's pension. And this was his father's judgment of his worth. "Oh, come now," Carolyn laughed, the sound like crystal breaking. "What's Jake going to do with 20 acres of bayou? He can barely take care of himself." Liberty's growl rumbled low in her throat, and Jake's hand tightened on her collar. The dog's amber eyes fixed on Carolyn with an intensity that made the woman shift uncomfortably in her seat. "There is one additional provision," Morrison said, consulting another document. "Additional documents or amendments may surface during the estate settlement period." Clayton waved dismissively. "Ancient history, Morrison. When can we begin the transfer?" Jake stood slowly, Liberty rising with fluid grace beside him. His war-damaged left leg ached, but he kept his shoulders straight. "Thank you for your time." He nodded to the lawyer, then looked at his brother. "Congratulations, Clayton. I hope it brings you everything you deserve." As they left the office, Jake heard Carolyn whisper to Clayton, "At least the family embarrassment is finally someone else's problem." Liberty pressed against Jake's leg as they walked to his battered pickup truck. The dog's warmth was the only comfort in a world that seemed determined to remind him he was unwanted, unwelcome, and unworthwhile. The humidity hung over Sanctuary Point like a shroud, thick enough to drink. Jake's pickup truck bounced along the gravel road that wound through towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. Liberty sat in the passenger seat, her nose pressed to the window, alert and watchful as they approached what would now be their home. The caretaker's cottage emerged from the green twilight like something from a forgotten photograph. Built in the 1920s, it was a modest Creole structure raised on brick piers to ward off flooding. White paint peeled from its board and batten siding, and the tin roof bore rust stains like old bloodstains. But the bones were solid, the cypress wood seasoned by decades of Louisiana weather. Behind the cottage, barely visible through a curtain of hanging moss, stood the ruins of the original Whitmore mansion. Fire had claimed it in 1962, leaving only blackened brick chimneys and crumbling foundation walls. Jake's grandfather had chosen to build the simple cottage rather than restore the grand house, a decision that had always puzzled the family. "Well, girl," Jake said, cutting the engine, "home sweet home." Liberty bounded from the truck with surprising energy for a war-wounded dog, immediately beginning a systematic patrol of the property. Her nose worked constantly, processing 1,000 scents that meant nothing to Jake but told her stories about this place. She moved with purpose as if she'd been here before, though Jake knew that was impossible. The cottage's interior was sparse but clean. Someone, probably his father, had maintained it over the years. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened by countless fires. The kitchen was functional, if dated, and the bedroom barely large enough for a single bed. It was a far cry from the luxury Clayton had inherited, but Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. That first night, as Jake sat on the small front porch listening to the symphony of the bayou, bullfrogs, nightbirds, the splash of something large moving through dark water, Liberty began to behave strangely. Instead of settling beside his chair as she usually did, she paced restlessly, whining low in her throat. "What's got into you?" Jake asked. But Liberty was focused on something beyond the porch light's reach. She kept looking toward the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by a wrought iron fence about 100 yards from the cottage. Sleep came hard that first night. Jake's war dreams mixed with the unfamiliar sounds of his new home, creating a restless soup of memory and anxiety. But Liberty was worse. She whined and paced, scratching at the bedroom door until Jake finally let her out. Through the window, he watched her trot purposefully toward the cemetery in the moonlight. The next morning brought their first visitor. A black Cadillac crunched up the gravel drive, and Clayton emerged wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jake's monthly disability check. His face was grim, his usual smugness replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Jake, we need to talk." Clayton didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past his brother into the cottage. His eyes swept the modest interior with barely concealed disgust. "This is about the property." "What about it?" Jake poured coffee from an old percolator, offering none to his brother. "I've had it appraised." Clayton pulled out a folder thick with documents. "The land's worthless, just like I thought. Wetlands restrictions, historical preservation concerns, access issues. But there's a solution." Jake waited, knowing better than to interrupt when Clayton was building to something. "Harrison Sterling wants to buy it. He's a developer, specializes in eco-friendly resort properties. He's offering $200,000 for the whole tract." "200,000?" Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "For 20 acres? I know it sounds generous, but Harrison sees potential where others don't. The thing is, there are some complications with the deed. Legal technicalities that need to be resolved quickly." Clayton's eyes shifted away from Jake's face. I could handle the paperwork for you. Make sure everything goes smoothly." Liberty chose that moment to return from her morning patrol, bursting through the screen door with mud on her paws. She took one look at Clayton, and her hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in her chest. "Control your dog, Jake." Clayton stepped back, genuine fear flickering in his eyes. "She's controlled. She just doesn't like you." Jake's voice was flat. "And I'm not selling. Don't be stupid. What are you going to do here? Live like a hermit in this shack while I'm running a multi-million-dollar business empire? Maybe." Jake scratched Liberty's ears, feeling her tension ease under his touch. "Maybe being a hermit's not so bad." Clayton's face reddened. "This is about father, isn't it? You think this proves something, him leaving you this worthless swamp? Wake up, Jake." He felt sorry for you. "This is charity, not love." The words hit like physical blows, but Jake kept his expression neutral. He'd learned in the army that showing pain only encouraged bullies to hit harder. "Get out, Clayton. I'm trying to help you." "No, you're trying to help yourself. Like always." Jake stood, and Liberty rose with him, her amber eyes fixed on Clayton with predatory intensity. "Get out of my house." Clayton gathered his papers with shaking hands. "You'll change your mind. When reality sets in, when you realize what you're throwing away, you'll come begging. And maybe I'll still be willing to help." "Maybe." The Cadillac's engine roared to life and gravel sprayed as Clayton accelerated away. Jake watched until the car disappeared into the tunnel of trees, then looked down at Liberty. The dog was still staring after the vehicle, her body rigid with alertness. "You don't trust him either, do you, girl?" Liberty's tail gave a single, decisive wag. Then she turned and headed back toward the cemetery, as if she had important work to do. That afternoon, Jake found the journals. They were hidden in the cottage's tiny attic, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath loose floorboards. His grandfather's handwriting covered page after page of careful observations. Weather patterns, wildlife behavior, property maintenance notes. But as Jake read deeper, the entries became stranger, more cryptic. "Family protection protocols must be maintained," one entry read. "The guardian understands. Trust the guardian." Another, dated just months before his grandfather's death. "Clayton shows his true nature. The test will reveal all. Jacob has the heart, but not yet the knowledge. Time will teach him." The final entry, written in a shaking hand. "If you are reading this, grandson, then Liberty has brought you here. Trust her. She knows what I could never tell you." Jake looked up from the journal to find Liberty sitting at the foot of the attic ladder, watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. For a moment, an impossible thought flickered through his mind. How could his grandfather have known about Liberty? The dog had come from a military kennel in Virginia, assigned to Jake after his injury. His grandfather had never met her, but somehow, impossibly, his grandfather had known. As twilight painted the bayou in shades of purple and gold, Jake sat on the cottage steps with the journals spread around him. Liberty lay beside him, her head resting on his knee, occasionally lifting her muzzle toward the cemetery as if listening to something only she could hear. Whatever secret Sanctuary Point held, Jake was beginning to understand that his inheritance was far more complicated than a simple piece of worthless swampland. His grandfather had left him a mystery, and Liberty was the key to solving it. The question was, did he have the courage to follow where she led? 2 weeks had passed since Jake discovered his grandfather's journals, and Liberty's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Each morning she would complete a methodical patrol of the property, but her attention always returned to the cemetery. She would sit for hours at the wrought iron gate, ears pricked forward, as if listening to conversations Jake couldn't hear. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning thick with fog rolling off the bayou. Jake was replacing rotted boards on the cottage's front steps when Liberty suddenly bolted toward the cemetery with an urgency that made his pulse quicken. By the time he caught up, she was digging frantically at the base of his great-grandfather's headstone, her powerful claws sending chunks of dark earth flying. "Liberty, stop!" Jake grabbed her collar, but she twisted away with a whine of frustration. Her amber eyes locked onto his, and in them he saw something that chilled him. Intelligence beyond what any dog should possess, and a desperate need to communicate something vital. That's when he noticed the ground where she'd been digging. The earth was softer here, recently disturbed despite the headstone's 1943 date. Someone had been here, and recently. Jake's military training kicked in as he examined the site more carefully. Footprints in the soft earth, partially obscured by morning dew. Boot prints, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. The same boots Clayton had been wearing during his visit. The sound of tires on gravel announced another visitor. Jake straightened as a white Lexus SUV emerged from the tree line, its pristine paint job looking absurdly out of place against the wild backdrop of the bayou. Clayton stepped out, but he wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit followed, his silver hair gleaming despite the humidity. "Jake," Clayton called out with forced cheerfulness, "I'd like you to meet Harrison Sterling, the developer I mentioned." Harrison Sterling moved with the calculated grace of a predator, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the property with the intensity of an appraiser. He was perhaps 50, lean and sharp-featured, with the kind of face that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Whitmore." Sterling's handshake was firm, his smile precisely calibrated. "Your brother has told me so much about you. A veteran, I understand. Thank you for your service." The words were right, but something in Sterling's tone made Jake's skin crawl. Liberty pressed against his leg, a low growl vibrating through her chest. "Beautiful property," Sterling continued, seemingly oblivious to the dog's hostility. "I can see why your family has held on to it for so long. The historical significance alone is remarkable." "What historical significance?" Jake asked, surprised by the comment. Clayton shot Sterling a sharp look. "Harrison's done extensive research on the area. He specializes in preserving historical properties through sensitive development." "Indeed." Sterling's smile never wavered. "The Underground Railroad had several stations in this region. Properties like this one were crucial to the freedom movement. It's important to honor that legacy while creating something beautiful for future generations." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. His grandfather's journals had mentioned the Underground Railroad, but only in passing references. How did Sterling know so much about Sanctuary Point's history? "The thing is, Jake," Clayton interjected, pulling out a leather portfolio, "there's been a development. A legal complication with the property deed." "What kind of complication?" "It turns out there's an environmental assessment requirement that wasn't completed before Father's death. The state can seize the property if it's not resolved within 30 days. Clayton's words came in a rush as if he'd rehearsed them. "But Harrison's willing to help. He'll handle all the legal issues as part of the purchase agreement." Sterling nodded gravely. "Environmental compliance is a specialty of mine. I have lawyers who deal with these regulations daily. We could have this resolved and the sale completed within the week." Jake looked from one man to the other, his suspicion growing. "Show me the documentation." "Of course." Clayton handed him a thick folder. "It's all there. State Environmental Office, EPA guidelines, penalty clauses. If we don't act quickly, you could lose everything." The papers looked official enough, covered in government seals and legal terminology that might as well have been written in a foreign language. But something felt wrong. Jake's instincts, honed by years of combat, were screaming warnings he couldn't yet articulate. "I need time to review this." Time is exactly what we don't have, Sterling said, his patience wearing thin around the edges. The state moves quickly on these matters. Each day we delay increases the risk of forfeiture. Liberty chose that moment to bark, a sharp sound that cut through the morning air like a gunshot. All three men turned to look at her, and Jake noticed something that made his blood freeze. Sterling's face had gone pale, and his left hand was trembling slightly. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Clayton suggested quickly, "away from distractions." But Jake was studying Sterling's reaction to Liberty. The man was genuinely afraid of the dog, which was strange. Liberty was large and imposing, but she was sitting calmly at Jake's side. What was Sterling seeing that Jake wasn't? "No," Jake said finally. "I need to consult my own lawyer before I sign anything." "Jake, be reasonable." Clayton's mask of concern was slipping, revealing the frustration beneath. "You don't have money for lawyers. This is a gift. Harrison's offering you a way out of an impossible situation." "A way out of what?" Jake's voice hardened. "I was doing just fine until you showed up with your emergency paperwork." Sterling stepped forward, and Jake noticed the man's expensive shoes were muddy, the same mud that surrounded the cemetery where someone had been digging. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand your caution, but consider this. Even if you fight the environmental issues and win, what then? You'll still be sitting on 20 acres of unusable swampland. No income, no prospects, no future." "Is that really what your father intended when he left you this place?" The question hit its mark. Jake felt the familiar ache of self-doubt, the whisper that had followed him since childhood. Maybe he really was the family failure. Maybe his father had left him this property not as a gift, but as a final disappointment. But then Liberty stood and walked deliberately to Sterling, her amber eyes fixed on his face. She sat directly in front of him and stared, not aggressively, but with the kind of focused attention that made Sterling fidget and look away. "Your dog seems to have taken a liking to me," Sterling said with a forced laugh. Jake watched the interaction and realized Sterling was lying. Liberty wasn't showing affection. She was studying him, the way she used to study potential threats in Afghanistan. She was reading him, processing information, and what she was learning was making her very, very alert. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Jake said quietly. "I'll review the documents and get back to you." Clayton's face flushed red. "Damn it, Jake, you're being stubborn just to spite me. This is exactly why Father left you this worthless piece of—" "Get out!" Jake's voice carried the authority of a man who had once commanded soldiers in combat. "Both of you. Now!" After the Lexus disappeared into the trees, Jake sat on the cemetery gate and looked at Liberty. The dog was still staring down the road, her body tense with alertness. "What do you know that I don't, girl?" Liberty turned to him, then walked to the spot where she'd been digging earlier. She looked back at Jake, then at the disturbed earth, then back at Jake. The message was clear. Dig here. That evening, Jake spread his grandfather's journals across the kitchen table and read by the light of a kerosene lamp. Liberty lay at his feet, occasionally lifting her head toward the window as if listening for something. In the third journal, Jake found what he was looking for. An entry dated 1987, 2 years after Harrison Sterling would have been born. The Sterling family continues their attempts to reclaim what they believe is theirs. They fail to understand that some debts can never be repaid, some sins never forgiven. The land knows the truth, even if the courts do not. Jacob will understand when the time comes. The guardian will show him. Jake looked down at Liberty, his heart pounding. His grandfather had been writing about Harrison Sterling's family 35 years ago. This wasn't about development or environmental compliance. This was about revenge. The revelation about the Sterling family's history sent Jake diving deeper into his grandfather's journals, but it was Liberty who led him to the real treasure. 3 days after Clayton and Harrison's visit, she began a new ritual. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, she would trot to the cemetery and sit beside a particular headstone, not his grandfather's, but that of one Ezra Whitmore, dated 1899. Jake followed her on the fourth morning, coffee in hand, watching as she performed what could only be described as a vigil. She would sit perfectly still for exactly 15 minutes, then begin digging at the base of the stone, not frantically, as she had before, but with methodical precision, as if following instructions only she could hear. "What is it, girl?" Jake knelt beside her, examining the weathered marble. Ezra Whitmore had been his great-great-grandfather, a man whose name appeared only briefly in family stories. But as Jake brushed away the accumulated dirt and moss, he found something that made his heart race: fresh scratches in the stone, forming what looked almost like an arrow pointing toward the old mansion ruins. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A black woman in her 70s emerged from a battered pickup truck, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had survived more than her share of hardships. She was small but sturdy, her silver hair braided and pinned in a neat crown, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. "You must be Jacob Whitmore," she said, climbing the cottage steps with surprising agility. "I'm Esther Washington. Your grandfather and I were friends." Jake invited her in, noting how Liberty immediately approached the woman with tail wagging, a rare display of instant trust. Esther scratched behind the dog's ears with practiced familiarity. "She knows me," Esther explained. "I helped your grandfather train her mother." "Her mother? Rex's daughter?" "Your grandfather bred that line special, working dogs with a purpose." Esther accepted the coffee Jake offered, settling into the worn armchair by the fireplace. "Jacob, there are things about this property you need to know. Things your grandfather couldn't put in any will." Over the next hour, Esther Washington painted a picture of Sanctuary Point that transformed Jake's understanding of his inheritance. The property hadn't just been connected to the Underground Railroad, it had been a crucial terminus, the last stop before freedom. Escaped slaves had hidden in the extensive cave system beneath the mansion, guided by conductors who knew the secret passages. "Your great-great-grandfather Ezra was the last conductor," Esther explained. "When the Civil War ended, he documented everything: names, dates, routes. He buried it all to protect the people who'd helped. Some of those families are still around, still grateful." "Why is this relevant now?" Esther's expression darkened. "Because the Sterling family owned the plantation those people escaped from. Harrison Sterling's great-great-grandfather was Josiah Sterling, one of the cruelest slave owners in Louisiana. When Ezra helped his slaves escape, Josiah tried to have him arrested. Failed, but he never forgot. Neither did his family." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about development or environmental compliance. Harrison Sterling was trying to reclaim what his family considered stolen property, even after 150 years. "There's more," Esther continued. "Your grandfather knew Harrison would come eventually. He prepared for it. That's why he bred the dogs special, why he left you specific instructions." "What instructions?" "Check under Ezra's headstone. Liberty will show you when the time is right." As if summoned by her name, Liberty rose from her spot by the fire and walked to the door, looking back expectantly. Esther smiled. "Looks like the time is right." The three of them walked to the cemetery as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. Liberty led them directly to Ezra's grave, where she immediately began digging. But this time something was different. After only a few minutes, her claws struck metal. Jake knelt and helped her uncover a small metal box, about the size of a cigar humidor. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents that made his grandfather's journals look like casual reading property deeds dating back to 1847, survey maps showing the cave system in precise detail, and most shocking of all, a collection of daguerreotypes showing escaped slaves in the hidden chambers beneath the mansion. "My God," Jake whispered, handling the fragile images with reverence. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were proof of human courage in the face of unimaginable oppression. "There's more," Esther said quietly. "Look at the last photograph." It showed a group of conductors, white and black, standing together outside what was clearly the original Whitmore mansion. In the center stood a young man Jake recognized from old family portraits, Ezra Whitmore. But it was the inscription on the back that stopped his heart. "The Guardians of Freedom. May their vigilance never end. E.W., 1863. "Guardians," Jake repeated, remembering his grandfather's cryptic journal entries. "Your family has been guardians for 5 generations," Esther explained, "protecting not just the property, but the memory of what happened here, the people who found freedom because of this place." That evening, as Jake sat studying the photographs by lamplight, Liberty suddenly raised her head and growled. A moment later, headlights swept across the cottage windows. Jake recognized the sound of Clayton's Cadillac, but there was another vehicle with it. Through the window, Jake watched his brother emerge from his car, followed by Harrison Sterling and 2 men Jake didn't recognize. The strangers were large, wearing dark suits despite the heat, and they moved with the predatory grace of hired muscle. Clayton pounded on the door. "Jake! We need to talk! Now!" Jake opened the door but didn't invite them in. Liberty positioned herself between him and the visitors, her hackles raised. "This is your last chance," Clayton said without preamble. "Sign the papers tonight, or face the consequences." "What consequences?" Harrison Sterling stepped forward, his earlier charm replaced by cold calculation. "The environmental violations are real, Mr. Whitmore, but that's just the beginning. I've done extensive research on this property. There are zoning violations, tax irregularities, questions about the original land grants. I can make your life very difficult. Or," Clayton added, his voice taking on a wheedling tone, "you can be smart. Take the money, start over somewhere else. Somewhere more suitable for someone in your condition." The casual cruelty of the comment hit Jake like a physical blow. His own brother was using his war injuries as leverage, reducing him to a damaged thing to be managed and disposed of. "Get off my property," Jake said quietly. One of Sterling's men stepped forward, but Liberty's snarl stopped him cold. The dog's eyes were fixed on the stranger with the kind of focus that promised violence. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said. "This property belongs with people who understand its true value, people who can honor its history properly." "Honor?" Jake felt anger rising in his chest, clean and hot. "You want to honor the history of slaves escaping your family's plantation?" Sterling's mask slipped completely, revealing the hatred beneath. "My family built this region. We created prosperity, civilization, order. What happened here was theft, pure and simple. I'm just taking back what was stolen." "Then you understand exactly nothing about honor." Jake closed the door and threw the deadbolt. Through the window he watched the 4 men stand in his yard for several minutes, their voices raised in argument. Finally they got back in their vehicles and drove away, but Jake knew they'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't be asking politely. That night, he found another journal entry, one that seemed to speak directly to his situation. The guardians must be willing to sacrifice everything to protect what matters. The land remembers. The land endures. Trust liberty. Trust yourself. The truth will set us all free. Jake looked at Liberty, who was standing at the window, still watching the road where their enemies had disappeared. "Looks like we're in for a fight, girl." Liberty's tail gave a single, decisive wag. But she was ready. The attack came at dawn, swift and brutal as a lightning strike. Jake woke to Liberty's urgent barking and the sound of vehicles surrounding the cottage. Through the bedroom window he counted 4 trucks and at least 8 men, all wearing sheriff's department uniforms that looked authentic enough to fool a casual observer. "Jacob Whitmore," a voice boomed through a bullhorn. "This is Sheriff's Deputy Morrison. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of environmental violations and failure to comply with state regulations. Exit the building with your hands visible." Jake's military training kicked in immediately. He rolled from the bed, staying low as he moved to the window. The men outside weren't moving like real law enforcement. Their positions were wrong, their weapons handling sloppy. These were hired thugs in costume, but their badges would probably fool any neighbor who might witness this charade. Liberty pressed against his leg, her amber eyes reflecting the same recognition. These weren't police officers. "You have 60 seconds to comply or we're coming in." Jake grabbed his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. Someone was jamming communications, another sign this wasn't a legitimate police operation. Real cops didn't need to cut phone lines to serve a warrant. Through the kitchen window, Jake spotted movement in the tree line. More men positioned to cut off any escape route through the bayou. Sterling had planned this carefully, turning Sanctuary Point into a trap. 30 seconds. Jake made his decision. He couldn't fight 8 armed men, but he didn't have to. He and Liberty knew this property better than anyone, including routes the attackers couldn't possibly have discovered. He grabbed the metal box containing Ezra's documents and photographs, stuffing them into a waterproof bag along with his grandfather's most important journals. Whatever happened next, those artifacts had to survive. "Time's up! Move in!" The front door exploded inward as 2 men with a battering ram demolished the simple wooden frame. But Jake and Liberty were already gone, slipping out the back window and into the pre-dawn darkness of the bayou. Jake heard shouts of frustration from inside the cottage as the fake deputies discovered their quarry had vanished. Flashlight beams swept the backyard, but Jake and Liberty were already 50 yards away, moving through marsh grass tall enough to conceal a man. "Find them!" Harrison Sterling's voice carried clearly across the water. He wasn't even bothering to maintain the police charade anymore. "They can't have gone far." Jake led Liberty to a section of elevated ground near the old mansion ruins, where ancient live oaks provided cover. From this position, he could observe the cottage while remaining hidden. What he saw made his blood boil. The fake deputies were ransacking his home with systematic thoroughness, throwing furniture aside, dumping drawers, tearing apart everything his grandfather had left him. One man emerged from the cottage carrying Jake's Purple Heart in its presentation case, tossing it carelessly into the back of a truck like worthless junk. But it was the sight of Clayton directing the search that hurt most. His brother wasn't just complicit in this charade, he was orchestrating it, pointing the searchers toward places where important documents might be hidden. "Check the attic again," Clayton called out. "He found something up there. I saw him with old papers." Carolyn emerged from one of the trucks looking immaculate despite the early hour. She walked to the cottage like a queen surveying conquered territory, her expression one of satisfied triumph. "Any sign of the dog?" she asked Sterling. "Not yet, but it doesn't matter. Without proof of the historical significance, Whitmore has no legal standing. We proceed as planned." Liberty growled low in her throat, and Jake placed a calming hand on her neck. They couldn't act rashly. Not yet. As the sun climbed higher, the fake deputies expanded their search to the cemetery. Jake watched in horror as they overturned headstones and trampled grave sites, desecrating the final resting places of 5 generations of his family. When they reached Ezra's grave, Clayton personally supervised the excavation. "There." Clayton pointed to the empty hole where Liberty had dug up the metal box. "He found something here. Search the area for more burial sites." Sterling studied the disturbed earth with growing agitation. What exactly are we looking for? Documentation. Proof of historical significance. Without it, the property is just worthless swampland. Clayton's voice carried a note of desperation. He has to have found something. Why else would he refuse to sell? Jake almost smiled. His brother was so consumed with greed that he couldn't conceive of any other motivation. The idea that Jake might value the land for reasons beyond profit was incomprehensible to Clayton's narrow mind. The search continued for 3 hours, growing more frantic and destructive as the men found nothing of value. Finally, Sterling called a halt. Enough. We're proceeding with the legal action regardless. Morrison, file the environmental violation reports with the state. Make sure the documentation shows immediate danger to public health. The man Sterling addressed as Morrison nodded. He was older than the others, wearing an actual deputy's uniform that looked more authentic. Jake realized with growing alarm that at least one real law enforcement officer was part of this conspiracy. "What about Whitmore?" Deputy Morrison asked. "He's a fugitive now, resisting arrest, fleeing from legal authorities. When we find him, he'll be facing serious federal charges." Sterling's smile was cold as winter. No court will listen to the ravings of a mentally unstable veteran with a criminal record. After the trucks departed, Jake and Liberty remained hidden for another hour, making sure the coast was clear. When they finally approached the cottage, the destruction was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. Every piece of furniture was overturned or broken. The kitchen had been thoroughly ransacked, with broken dishes scattered across the floor. In the bedroom, Jake's few possessions were strewn about like debris after a tornado. But the real violation was personal. They had dumped out the small wooden box containing his wife's jewelry, scattering the precious mementos across the floor like worthless trinkets. His purple heart case lay open and empty in the corner, the metal itself missing. Liberty whined softly, pressing against Jake's leg as he surveyed the devastation. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. He was alone, branded a fugitive with no resources except the clothes on his back and the historical documents he'd managed to save. Then he remembered Esther Washington's words, "Your family has been guardians for 5 generations." The Whitmores hadn't survived 150 years of challenges by giving up when things got difficult. Jake pulled out his grandfather's journals and found the entry he was looking for. When the enemy strikes, the guardian does not retreat. He adapts, he endures, he fights back with truth as his weapon. That afternoon, Jake made his way through the bayou to Esther Washington's small house on the outskirts of town. She took one look at his disheveled appearance and Liberty's agitated state, then ushered them inside without questions. "They came for you," she said simply. "Fake police raid. They destroyed everything." Jake set the waterproof bag on her kitchen table. "But I saved the important documents." Esther nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud. Now we fight back properly." She made coffee while Jake spread out the photographs and deeds, explaining what had happened. When he finished, Esther was quiet for a long moment. "Sterling's made a serious mistake," she said finally. "He's acted too soon, shown his hand too clearly. Now we can prove criminal conspiracy." "How?" "That deputy looked real enough." "Morrison's real, all right, but he's also corrupt. Been taking Sterling's money for years. The FBI's had him under investigation for months." Esther's smile was sharp as a blade. "I may be old, but I still have friends in important places." She made a phone call that lasted 20 minutes, speaking in low tones to someone she addressed as Agent Rodriguez. When she hung up, her expression was grimly satisfied. "Federal agents will be here tomorrow morning. They want to see everything, The documents, the photographs, evidence of the fake police raid. Sterling just committed multiple federal crimes, including impersonating law enforcement officers. Jake felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. What about Clayton? Conspiracy charges at minimum, possibly more, depending on how deep his involvement goes. Esther's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry, Jacob. I know he's your brother. Jake looked at Liberty, who was lying peacefully by the fireplace for the first time in days. The dog seemed to understand that they had found sanctuary, at least temporarily. Blood doesn't make family, Jake said quietly. Loyalty does, and Clayton chose his side a long time ago. As night fell over the bayou, Jake sat on Esther's porch with Liberty at his feet, watching fireflies dance among the cypress trees. Tomorrow would bring federal agents and justice. Tonight he was simply a guardian keeping watch, as his family had done for 5 generations. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this began, Jake felt like he might actually win. The federal agents arrived at dawn, but they weren't alone. Jake watched from Esther's kitchen window as black SUVs surrounded her small house, followed by local police cars and what appeared to be half the sheriff's department. Agent Rodriguez, a compact woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, led the procession to Esther's front door. "Mr. Whitmore," she said without preamble, "we need to move quickly. Our investigation shows Sterling has connections we didn't anticipate. This goes deeper than property fraud." Jake spread the historical documents across Esther's dining room table while Liberty positioned herself near the window, alert for any signs of trouble. Agent Rodriguez examined each photograph and deed with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to building federal cases from fragile evidence. "These are extraordinary," she murmured, handling a daguerreotype of escaped slaves with white-gloved hands. "The Smithsonian will want copies for their Underground Railroad exhibition, but more importantly, they establish clear historical significance that makes Sterling's environmental claims fraudulent." "What about my brother?" Jake asked, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Clayton Whitmore is in federal custody as of 2 hours ago. He broke when we showed him the evidence of his conspiracy with Sterling. Apparently he thought he was just helping with a standard real estate transaction." Agent Rodriguez's expression suggested she had little sympathy for such willful ignorance. "He's cooperating fully now." Jake felt no satisfaction at his brother's downfall, only a hollow sadness for the relationship that had died long before this moment. Clayton had chosen greed over family, lies over truth, and now he would face the consequences. But Agent Rodriguez's next words shattered any hope of a simple resolution. "The problem is Harrison Sterling. He's vanished, along with his private security team. We raided his New Orleans office this morning and found evidence of a much larger operation. Sterling's been acquiring historical properties throughout the South, using fraudulent environmental claims and corrupted local officials. The profits are being funneled through offshore accounts to fund what appears to be a white supremacist organization." The room went silent except for the ticking of Esther's antique mantel clock. Jake felt the familiar chill of combat awareness, the recognition that a dangerous enemy was still at large and capable of striking back. "He'll come for the property," Jake said quietly. "The documents prove it was a crucial Underground Railroad site. That makes it a symbol of everything his people hate." "We've assigned protection to both of you," Agent Rodriguez replied, "but Sterling has resources and connections we're still mapping. He could have sympathizers in local law enforcement, state government, even federal agencies." As if summoned by their conversation, Liberty suddenly raised her head and growled, her amber eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Through the glass, Jake saw smoke rising from the direction of Sanctuary Point. "He's burning it down," Jake whispered, his heart breaking as he realized what was happening. "He can't steal it." so he's destroying it. The convoy of federal vehicles raced through the bayou roads toward Sanctuary Point, but Jake knew they would be too late. Sterling had calculated this perfectly. While the authorities focused on legal proceedings, he was eliminating the evidence with fire. When they reached the property, the cottage was fully engulfed in flames that painted the morning sky orange and black. The volunteer fire department was already on scene, but their efforts were focused on preventing the blaze from spreading to the surrounding wetlands. The building itself was beyond saving. Jake stood watching his home burn, feeling each collapsing beam like a physical blow. 5 generations of family history, his grandfather's careful preservation of the past, all of it reduced to ash and smoke. Liberty pressed against his leg, whining softly in sympathy for his pain. But the worst was yet to come. Agent Rodriguez approached with her cell phone pressed to her ear, her face grim. "We just received reports of explosions at the cemetery. Sterling's using some kind of demolition charges." They ran through the smoke-filled air toward the family burial ground, and what Jake saw there nearly brought him to his knees. The wrought iron fence was twisted and broken, headstones toppled and shattered by the blasts. Ezra Whitmore's grave had been completely obliterated, the marble monument reduced to fragments scattered across scorched earth. But Sterling hadn't stopped with destruction. In the center of the cemetery, he had erected a crude wooden cross and doused it with gasoline. As Jake watched in horror, a figure emerged from the smoke. Harrison Sterling himself, dressed in military-style fatigues and carrying an assault rifle. "Jacob Whitmore," Sterling's voice carried across the devastated cemetery, "come face the consequences of your family's crimes." Agent Rodriguez immediately called for backup while positioning her agents around the perimeter, but Sterling had chosen his ground well. The cemetery sat on a small hill surrounded by open ground, giving him clear fields of fire in all directions. "This land was stolen from my family," Sterling shouted. "Built on the blood of honest white men who tried to maintain civilization. Your ancestors were thieves and race traitors." Jake felt Liberty tense beside him, her military training recognizing the threat. He placed a restraining hand on her neck, knowing that Sterling would shoot the dog without hesitation. "Well, let me talk to him," Jake called to Agent Rodriguez. "Absolutely not. This man is clearly unstable and heavily armed." But Jake was already moving, walking slowly across the open ground toward the cemetery with his hands visible. Sterling's rifle tracked his movement, the muzzle never wavering from center mass. "That's close enough," Sterling commanded when Jake reached the broken fence. Up close, Jake could see that Sterling's appearance had deteriorated dramatically. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by surplus military gear that hung loosely on his frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with the kind of fanatical fervor that Jake had seen in enemy combatants overseas. "You want to know what your precious family really did?" Sterling snarled. "They helped destroy the natural order. White civilization built this country, and your ancestors helped tear it down. Every slave that escaped through this property was an act of treason against the white race." Jake felt anger rise in his throat, clean and hot. Those weren't slaves who escaped. They were human beings seeking freedom. Freedom to destroy everything we built. Look around you. This is what your progressive paradise leads to. Chaos, destruction, the collapse of civilization itself. Sterling's rant continued, but Jake was studying the man's position, looking for weaknesses. The assault rifle was military grade, but Sterling was holding it like someone who had learned to shoot from YouTube videos rather than proper training. His stance was wrong, his grip uncertain. More importantly, Sterling was alone. Whatever private army he had assembled was either dead, captured, or had abandoned him when the federal investigation began closing in. This was the desperate last stand of a man who had lost everything and blamed the world for his failures. "Your grandfather thought he was so clever," Sterling continued, spittle flying from his lips, hiding his documents, training his dogs, preparing his little tests. But I've won. Your property is destroyed, your family legacy is ash, and soon you'll join your ancestors in the ground. Sterling raised the rifle to his shoulder, and Jake knew his time had run out. But before the man could fire, Liberty exploded from the tree line where she had circled around during Jake's distraction. She hit Sterling at full speed, her 70 pounds of muscle and fury driving him backward into the ruins of Ezra's headstone. The rifle discharged skyward as Sterling fell, and federal agents swarmed the cemetery. The confrontation was over in seconds, but the damage was done. Sterling had succeeded in destroying Sanctuary Point, erasing 5 generations of family history and the evidence of its role in the Underground Railroad. As medics treated Sterling's injuries and agents secured the scene, Jake knelt among the broken headstones of his ancestors. The physical destruction was devastating, but something deeper had been lost. The continuity of memory, the tangible connection to the past that his grandfather had spent his life protecting. Liberty approached and dropped something at his feet. It was a fragment of Ezra's headstone, blackened by the explosion but still bearing part of the inscription, "Guardian of Freedom." Jake picked up the broken marble and held it to his chest, feeling the weight of 5 generations of responsibility. The buildings could be rebuilt, the cemetery restored, but the true victory belonged to Sterling. He had broken the chain of guardianship that had protected this place for 150 years. As the sun set over the smoldering ruins of Sanctuary Point, Jake Whitmore faced the hardest truth of his life. Sometimes the good guys lose, and sometimes evil wins through sheer destructive force. But looking into Liberty's amber eyes, he saw something that Sterling had missed in his calculations. The dog's expression wasn't defeat, it was determination. She had protected him during the attack, just as her ancestors had protected his grandfather. The guardianship wasn't broken. It was just beginning a new chapter. The truth began unraveling 3 days after Sterling's arrest, starting with a phone call that changed everything. Jake was staying in Esther Washington's guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the destruction of his family's legacy, when Agent Rodriguez knocked on the door with an expression he couldn't read. "We found something at Sterling's compound," she said without preamble. "You need to see this." The drive to the FBI field office in New Orleans passed in tense silence. Liberty sat in the back seat, her amber eyes reflecting Jake's own anxiety. Whatever the agents had discovered was significant enough to pull him away from the ruins of Sanctuary Point on a day when he could barely summon the energy to get dressed. The evidence room contained artifacts that made Jake's heart stop. Spread across metal tables were items he recognized from his childhood. His grandfather's pocket watch, family photographs dating back to the 1800s, and most shocking of all, documents in his grandfather's handwriting that he had never seen before. Sterling had been planning this for years, Agent Rodriguez explained. His people burglarized your grandfather's house multiple times before his death, copying documents and stealing others, but they missed the most important items because they didn't understand what they were looking for. She led Jake to a particular table where a leather-bound journal lay open. The handwriting was definitely his grandfather's, but the content was unlike anything in the journals Jake had found. "This is your grandfather's real will," Agent Rodriguez said quietly. "Written in his own hand, witnessed and notarized just 2 weeks before his death. The will read in the lawyer's office was a decoy." Jake read the document with growing amazement. According to this version, Clayton received only a modest trust fund, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The bulk of the estate, including the mansion and liquid assets, belonged to Jake. But there was more. "Your grandfather knew about Sterling's obsession," Agent Rodriguez continued. "He spent the last 5 years of his life gathering evidence of Sterling's criminal activities, documenting his connections to white supremacist groups, even recording conversations where Sterling outlined his plans to acquire underground railroad sites for destruction. She handed Jake a small digital recorder. This was hidden in a safety deposit box your grandfather rented under an assumed name. The box number was tattooed on Liberty's collar in UV ink, invisible unless you know to look for it. Jake stared at Liberty, who was sitting calmly beside the evidence table as if she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. She knew? Military working dogs can be trained to respond to specific triggers. Your grandfather spent months conditioning her to lead you to various locations on the property when certain circumstances occurred. She wasn't just digging randomly, she was following a carefully programmed sequence designed to reveal information gradually. The recordings on the device were devastating. Sterling's voice, captured in crystal clarity, outlined plans not just for Sanctuary Point, but for dozens of other historically significant properties throughout the South. He described underground railroad sites as monuments to white genocide that needed to be eliminated to prevent them from inspiring racial mixing and cultural destruction. More damning still were recordings of Sterling's conversations with corrupt officials, including Deputy Morrison and 3 state environmental inspectors who had been taking bribes to file false reports. The conspiracy reached into the governor's office, with Sterling boasting about having patriots in positions of power who shared his vision of restoring true American values. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Rodriguez played a recording dated just 1 month before Jake's grandfather's death. Sterling's voice was clear and cold. The old man's too clever for a direct approach, but everyone has weaknesses. His grandson's a broken veteran with PTSD, simple enough to drive him to suicide and claim the property through the other brother. Jake felt Liberty press against his leg as the recording continued. Sterling had been planning Jake's death from the beginning, using his own trauma and mental health struggles as weapons against him. "Your grandfather knew," Agent Rodriguez said softly. "That's why he created the elaborate test with the inheritance. He needed you to discover your own strength, to understand the value of what you were protecting before you could face Sterling's final assault." The evidence room door opened and Clayton entered, flanked by 2 federal marshals. Jake's brother looked haggard, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his usual arrogance deflated into something approaching humility. "Jake," Clayton said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Agent Rodriguez nodded permission, and Clayton approached the evidence table with obvious reluctance. "I never wanted this to happen. When Sterling first approached me, he said he just wanted to buy worthless swampland for development. He offered me a substantial finder's fee. And I thought," Clayton's voice broke, "I thought you'd be better off with the money. I thought I was helping you." Jake studied his brother's face, looking for signs of deception, but finding only genuine remorse. "When did you realize what Sterling really wanted?" "When I saw him at the cemetery with explosives. That's when I understood this wasn't about development. It was about destruction, about hatred." Clayton's hands shook as he continued. "I tried to stop him, tried to call the FBI myself, but he had my family under surveillance. He threatened Carolyn and the kids if I didn't cooperate." The mention of Carolyn brought another revelation. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a thick file labeled Carolyn Sterling Whitmore and opened it to reveal surveillance photographs and financial records. "Your sister-in-law isn't who she claims to be," the agent said. "Her real name is Carolyn Sterling. She's Harrison's younger sister, placed in your brother's life 20 years ago as a long-term intelligence asset." Clayton's face went white. "That's impossible. We met in college, fell in love naturally. We have children together." "The children are yours," Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "DNA tests prove paternity, but the relationship was orchestrated from the beginning. Carolyn was trained from childhood to infiltrate your family, gather information, and position herself to influence family decisions when the time came. Jake watched his brother process this information, seeing the exact moment when 20 years of memories recontextualized themselves. Every major decision, every family argument, every moment of supposed intimacy, all of it calculated manipulation by someone trained to destroy their family from within. "She convinced me you were mentally unstable," Clayton whispered. "Said your PTSD made you dangerous, that you needed to be institutionalized for your own good. I believed her because I loved her." The final piece of the puzzle came when Agent Rodriguez produced a document that made Jake's hands tremble. It was a military service record for one Rex Whitmore, Liberty's predecessor and Jake's grandfather's partner in the Underground Railroad Preservation Project. "Your grandfather wasn't just maintaining family history," Agent Rodriguez explained. "He was part of a classified military intelligence operation called Project Guardian. The government has been quietly protecting historically significant Underground Railroad sites for decades, using retired military personnel as caretakers." She handed Jake an official letter bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. "Jake Whitmore, by virtue of your military service and demonstrated loyalty to the Guardian mission, you are hereby appointed as the official custodian of Sanctuary Point Historical Preserve, with full federal protection and funding for restoration." The letter was signed by the Secretary of Defense himself, dated just 3 days earlier. Jake stared at the document, struggling to comprehend how completely his understanding of the situation had shifted. "Liberty isn't just a dog," Agent Rodriguez said gently. "She's a federal asset, trained specifically for this mission. Her bloodline has been protecting Guardian sites for 3 generations. When your grandfather died, she was transferred to your care through official channels disguised as a veteran support program." Jake knelt beside Liberty, looking into her amber eyes with new understanding. "You've been protecting me this whole time." Liberty's tail wagged once, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Jake felt like he could breathe freely. The truth wasn't just liberating, it was transformative. His inheritance wasn't worthless swampland, but a sacred trust. His dog wasn't just a companion, but a partner, and his family's legacy wasn't destroyed, but ready to be rebuilt, stronger than ever. Clayton approached hesitantly. "Jake, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if there's any way I can help repair what I've broken." Jake looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw not the arrogant, greedy man who had tormented him for years, but a victim of the same conspiracy that had tried to destroy them both. "Blood makes us brothers," Jake said, extending his hand. "But choices make us family. You chose truth when it mattered most." As Clayton grasped his hand, tears streaming down his face, Jake felt something shift in his chest. The bitterness and resentment that had poisoned their relationship for decades was draining away, replaced by the possibility of genuine healing. The guardianship would continue, but this time Jake wouldn't stand watch alone. 6 months later, Jake stood on the newly constructed observation deck overlooking Sanctuary Point, watching the morning sun paint the bayou in shades of gold and amber. The Federal Restoration Project had transformed the property into something beyond his grandfather's wildest dreams, a living monument to courage, freedom, and the power of ordinary people to change the world. The new visitor center occupied the site where the cottage had burned, its architecture designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment while housing state-of-the-art exhibits about the Underground Railroad. Interactive displays allowed visitors to experience the dangerous journey from slavery to freedom, while preserved artifacts, including Ezra Whitmore's original documents, testified to the bravery of conductors and freedom seekers alike. But it was the cemetery that truly told the story. Federal archaeologists had discovered the remains of 17 escaped slaves buried in unmarked graves around the property, their final resting places now honored with simple granite markers bearing their names and stories. The destroyed headstones of the Whitmore family had been carefully restored, with Ezra's monument featuring a new inscription, "Guardian of Freedom, the Watch Continues." Liberty trotted up the steps to join Jake on the deck, moving with less stiffness now that her war injuries had been properly treated by military veterinarians. At her side bounded 3 puppies, Rex, Hope, and Freedom, the next generation of guardian dogs already showing the intelligence and loyalty that made their bloodline so remarkable. "The tour groups are arriving," Esther Washington called from below. At 75, she had become the preserve's head historian, her encyclopedic knowledge of local Underground Railroad history making her an invaluable guide for the thousands of visitors who came to learn about this chapter of American history. Jake descended the steps to meet the day's first group, a class of 5th graders from New Orleans, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. Among them walked Clayton, who had completed his community service requirement by volunteering as an assistant guide. The federal charges against him had been reduced to misdemeanors in exchange for his cooperation, but the real punishment had been the dissolution of his marriage and the loss of his law license. "Uncle Jake!" The voice belonged to Emma, Clayton's 8-year-old daughter, who had become one of Liberty's most devoted admirers. Since Carolyn's arrest and deportation, her marriage to Clayton had been part of a long-term espionage operation. The children spent most weekends at Sanctuary Point, helping with the restoration work and learning about their family's true history. "Ready for another adventure, kiddo?" Jake knelt to Emma's level as Liberty approached for her morning ear scratch. The little girl had inherited none of her mother's coldness, displaying instead a natural empathy and curiosity that reminded Jake powerfully of himself at that age. "Can I help feed the puppies after the tour?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with hope. "If you pay attention during the presentation," Jake replied with mock sternness that fooled no one. The morning tour followed the same route Jake and Liberty had walked countless times, but each telling revealed new layers of meaning. They started at the visitor center where children gasped at the sight of authentic slave shackles and marveled at the hidden compartments built into seemingly ordinary wagons. The exhibits didn't romanticize the horrors of slavery, but they celebrated the courage of those who risked everything to help others find freedom. From there, the group walked to the cemetery, where Esther told the story of each marked grave with the reverence it deserved. She spoke of families torn apart by slavery, of mothers who walked hundreds of miles carrying children on their backs, of men who faced down armed slave catchers with nothing but determination and faith. "This ground is sacred," Esther told the hushed children as they stood among the restored headstones. "Not because of any church or temple, but because it represents the best of human nature, people choosing to help strangers at great personal risk simply because it was the right thing to do." The final stop was the entrance to the cave system beneath the original mansion ruins. Federal engineers had stabilized the tunnels and installed lighting, allowing visitors to experience the underground chambers where freedom seekers had hidden during the most dangerous part of their journey. The children walked through the narrow passages in awed silence, trying to imagine what it felt like to trust your life to strangers in a hostile land. As the tour concluded and the school bus departed, Jake found himself alone with Clayton at the cemetery gates. The relationship between the brothers had slowly healed over the months of working together, but conversations between them still carried the weight of everything that had been broken and rebuilt. "I got a letter from the federal prosecutor yesterday," Clayton said quietly. "Harrison Sterling's been sentenced to life without parole. 15 counts of domestic terrorism, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 20 other federal charges." Jake nodded, feeling no satisfaction in Sterling's downfall. The man had been consumed by hatred so complete that it had destroyed everything he touched, including his own family. Carolyn was serving 25 years in federal prison, her children placed in protective custody and given new identities to shield them from their parents' legacy of extremism. What about the others? Most of the private security team took plea deals. Deputy Morrison got 15 years, and the state environmental inspectors are looking at similar sentences. Clayton's voice carried a note of wonder. I keep thinking about how close they came to succeeding. If Liberty hadn't led you to those documents. But she did, Jake replied simply. That's what family does. They protect each other, even when the cost is high. The word family hung between them, carrying all the complexity of their relationship. They would never be close the way brothers should be, but they had found something better than blood ties. They had found mutual respect and shared purpose. That evening, as the sun set over the bayou, Jake sat on the front porch of his new house, a modest but comfortable structure built near the visitor center. Liberty lay at his feet, while her puppies played in the yard, their antics providing entertainment and hope for the future. A car approached along the gravel drive, and Jake recognized the driver immediately. Sarah Washington, Esther's granddaughter, emerged from the sedan carrying a casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile that made Jake's heart beat faster. She was 48, a widow like himself, with kind eyes and the sort of quiet strength that came from surviving life's hardships without losing the capacity for joy. "Thought you might be hungry," Sarah said, settling beside him on the porch swing. "Grandmother's famous jambalaya." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance among the cypress trees. Sarah had become a regular presence at Sanctuary Point over the past few months, initially volunteering to help with the restoration project, but staying for reasons that had nothing to do with history or heritage. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Sarah said eventually, "about the guardian tradition continuing." Jake turned to study her profile in the fading light. They had talked about many things during their growing friendship, but the conversation she referenced had been particularly significant, a discussion about legacy, responsibility, and the courage required to commit to something larger than oneself. "The puppies will need handlers when they're old enough for training," Jake said carefully. "The federal program is expanding to other guardian sites throughout the South. And those handlers will need support systems, partners who understand the mission." Sarah's smile was gentle but determined. "I've spent my whole life hearing stories about the Underground Railroad, but I never thought I'd have the chance to be part of preserving that legacy." The proposal hung between them, unspoken but clearly understood. This wasn't just about romance, though Jake's feelings for Sarah had grown stronger with each passing day. This was about building something together, a family united by purpose rather than just passion, a partnership that would honor the past while protecting the future. Liberty raised her head and looked directly at Sarah, her amber eyes reflecting the same assessment Jake had seen her make of every person who entered their lives. After a long moment, the dog's tail wagged once, a clear signal of approval that made Sarah laugh with delight. "I think she likes me," Sarah said. "Liberty's an excellent judge of character," Jake replied, taking Sarah's hand in his. "She's never been wrong about people who matter." As they sat together on the porch, surrounded by the sounds of the awakening night, Jake felt a contentment he had never thought possible. The guardianship that had begun with his great-great-grandfather Ezra would continue, but it would no longer be a solitary burden. He had found his family, not just in Sarah and the promise of children to come, but in Clayton's slow redemption, in Esther's wisdom, in the community of people who had rallied to preserve this sacred place. 6 months ago, he had been a broken veteran living on what everyone called worthless swampland. Tonight, he was a guardian of freedom, a keeper of memory, and a man who had learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, it's the courage to stand watch over the things that matter most. Liberty's puppies bounded up the porch steps, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to be part of the family gathering. As Jake and Sarah laughed at their antics, the circle of love expanded to include these new guardians, these living symbols of hope and continuity. The watch would continue, passed from one generation to the next, as long as there were people willing to remember that freedom is never free. It must be earned, protected, and preserved by those who understand its true value. Under the stars that had witnessed centuries of courage and sacrifice, Jake Whitmore finally understood his grandfather's final gift. It wasn't just land or money or even family legacy. It was the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Sometimes life hands us what looks like nothing: a worthless piece of land, a broken relationship, or dreams that seem buried forever. But Jake's story reminds us that the most precious gifts often come disguised as disappointments. When his family betrayed him for money, when everyone called his inheritance worthless swampland, Jake discovered something priceless: a legacy of courage that had been waiting 150 years for the right guardian. Like Jake, many of us carry scars from life's battles, whether from war, loss, or family wounds that cut deep. But those very scars can become our strength, our qualification for protecting what truly matters. The German Shepherd Liberty knew what Jake's family couldn't see: that loyalty, truth, and unconditional love are worth more than any bank account. In our later years, we understand that happiness isn't found in accumulating wealth, but in discovering our purpose and sharing it with those who matter. Jake found his calling not in spite of his struggles, but because of them. Every setback prepared him for his moment of truth, when he had to choose between bitterness and hope, between isolation and family. What worthless gift in your life turned out to be your greatest treasure? Have you ever discovered that a painful experience actually prepared you for something beautiful? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.